So I'm off to Alaska on Tuesday, not for a holiday, but to witness this extraordinary summit that has been planned, that has been announced between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to discuss the war in Ukraine, war and peace in Ukraine. It's extraordinary, one, that it's happening in Alaska. And I guess the reason is that Alaska is about as close as you can get to Russia geographically and historically in the United States. Alaska was a part of the Russian Empire until it was bought by the Americans for the bargain price of $7 million in 1867. And I guess at that stage, the Russian Tsar needed some cash, badly needed some cash after losing the Crimean War. In today's money, by the way, that would be 132 million for Alaska, the size of, I don't know, Western Europe, I think, vaguely, full of extraordinary minerals and rare earth metals. So maybe the Russians regret having sold it in the first place. But of course, it's not about that territory. It's about what territories are going to be swapped in Ukraine, if they're going to be swapped at all, in order to bring about a ceasefire and possibly a peace. Now, Trump yesterday, in that typical Trumpian way, kind of slightly offhand, said, "Yeah, there'll be some stuff that's going to be swapped, some territory." And this morning, the Ukrainians shot back and said, "Hang on a minute, that sounds a little bit weird." Let's just listen to President Zelensky and his response to Trump's suggestion.
Ukrainians will not give their lands to the occupier. Ukraine is ready for real solutions that can bring peace. Any solutions that are without Ukraine are at the same time solutions against peace. They will not bring anything. These are dead solutions. They will never work.
Well, that's pretty definitive from the Ukrainian president, and perhaps he has to say that in public, because otherwise it looks as if he's just ceding all the authority in these discussions, in these talks to Donald Trump. And of course, Donald Trump's had a very difficult relationship with Zelensky. You remember the famous grilling in the Oval Office that took place at the end of February, actually more of an assault than a grilling. And I think Zelensky's right to feel some trepidation about whether Trump is actually going to represent his views at the table. And if you're not at the table, there's a danger that you'll be on the menu. Now, Trump has also been on a bit of a journey with Putin. You know, they've had 6 phone calls. He didn't like the last 2. He said that, you talk to Vladimir and he talks all nice and then he starts bombing hospitals in the middle of the night, something that was pointed out to Donald Trump by his wife, the First Lady Melania. You would have thought it's blaringly obvious if you look at the news headlines, but he needed all that. Anyway, but the thing about Trump, and we've discussed it with the German ambassador, is that he is absolutely determined to get that Nobel Peace Prize. And he seems to be kind of, prepping the ground or rolling the pitch. So just last night, he announced a peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, like a sort of amuse-bouche, like a starter course for the big one on Friday. And then, of course, we're all wondering, well, if you have all this muscle when it comes to peace, and if you're doing it, for your own good reasons, whatever, then why not use that in Israel, Gaza as well? So far, there's been no evidence of that happening whatsoever. Okay, let's go to Sir Mark Lyall-Grant. He's a UK ambassador, former UK ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor. Sir Mark, good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt.
It's good to speak to you. So what hopes or fears are you harbouring when it comes to this summit in Alaska on Friday?
Well, more fears than hopes, I would say, Matt, because it looks pretty clear that this is going to be a meeting between President Trump and President Putin, not including President Zelensky, at least in the first instance. And given that, President Trump has flip-flopped on support for Ukraine over the last 4 months, he's put all the pressure on Zelensky, not on Putin, and Putin is successfully played for time, stringing Steve Witkoff and President Trump along. There is a real risk that in his eagerness to do a deal, President Trump will accede to Russian demands, which haven't changed in the last 7 months, in a way that will be totally unacceptable to Ukraine. And he will then present that outcome as a great success and present it to Zelensky on a take it or leave it basis. And that would be bad for Ukraine and bad for Britain and European security more widely.
So the positive spin on this, and we heard some of that from the German ambassador just now in the studio, is that, Zelensky has spoken to Merz and to Macron and I guess to Starmer at some stage as well. And they will then, give a unified response, hopefully to to Marco Rubio, or maybe directly to the president, or maybe J.D. Vance, who's on holiday in the Cotswolds, and that will then be communicated to Trump to put that view to Putin. Do you think that might work? Or do we not trust Trump to kind of to convey these messages, however unified they might be?
Well, it's certainly worth trying. And, Britain itself has influence with President Trump. There's no question about that. And Keir Starmer has built a pretty good relationship with Trump. And the fact that this message is a united message of the Europeans, I think will carry some weight. But if you put President Trump more or less alone in the room with President Putin, who is a very experienced, hard negotiator, then I do have some concerns about the likely outcome.
I guess the thing to remind Donald Trump is that, there can only be some kind of ceasefire, let alone peace, if the Ukrainians sign up to it, and they won't sign up to something which has them being thrown under the bus.
Well, that is true, but equally, if he does sign up to something with Putin and then delivers it to Zelensky, and Zelensky says, no, that isn't acceptable, then we could expect President Trump to turn on Zelensky, as he has in the past, and say, you are responsible for this war continuing, and we will no longer provide you with weaponry, finance, etc. That is obviously the risk.
I mean, what Trump says repeatedly he wants to do, the reason why he's in this at all is he wants to stop the killing and the dying. And let's just assume that is what he wants. But he also really, really wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And he's made no bones about that. He's quite clear about it. Wanting that prize more than anything else, may be a good thing if it delivers, durable results, but it may also be a bad thing, because if that's all you care about, it doesn't necessarily mean that you care enough about all the other stuff.
Well, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it. I mean, he has said it's not about the Nobel Peace Prize. It is about stopping the killing. But of course, he hasn't hidden, as you say, his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's had some credibility in sense of having been involved, at least, in stopping some conflicts so far in the last 7 months. But I think you need to look at the sort of two elements of the possible deal. The one is land swaps that he's been talking about. And quite apart from the fact that they are sort of not possible under the Ukraine constitution to give away land like this, it would have to go to the Ukrainian parliament and possibly a referendum. We don't know the detail of what this means, because Ukraine is not occupying any Russian land at the moment. Russia is occupying more than 20% of Ukraine. So, what is this swap, and how will it be for the betterment, as he put it, of both parties? But perhaps even more important than the immediate land swaps is the question of how the sustainability of any ceasefire deal. And for a ceasefire to turn into a permanent peace, as we found in the Middle East recently, it requires a lot more. And in Ukraine in particular, it requires a security guarantee.
Okay.
That security guarantee's got to involve America.
Indeed. And might even, at some stage, even though the Russians don't want it, involve some membership of NATO. Stay on the line, Sir Mark. Let's bring in Bronwen Maddox, Director and Chief Executive at Chatham House, and, of course, a foreign affairs analyst. Bronwen, Trump talked about a possible swap of territories. The Russians have no territory occupied by Ukraine, so what was he talking about?
I don't know, I think, is the blunt answer. And it is very hard to give an answer to the Ukrainian retort that, look, this is rewarding Russia for what it's done for territory it's captured. It's giving it some of that permanently. That is probably going to have to be the shape of the deal. But basically, it's land for peace. I don't think it's land for land.
I mean, given the fact that Trump revels in being a disruptor, and given the fact that the conflict was, which is now 3.5 years old, was pretty much, certainly the front line was frozen, almost like the First World War front line, for the last, 2 years or so. Even if this thing ends in failure on Friday in Alaska, do you think it's better to have a go and try, even if the Ukrainians aren't at the table, then not to do so?
Yes, I do. We've gone from a point where each side thought it had a chance of winning to probably where each side thinks it's got a chance of losing. There's a real weakness on each side, and it has gone on a long time. These conflicts can get very embedded, so it's worth trying to bring it to a head. But the fact is that the two sides have been very far apart on their demands. It depends. Really, all this comes down to is how much Russia has agreed to roll back some of its demands. Sounds like it has on the scope of land, but what about changing the government in Ukraine, which has been one of its its things. So if Trump has got Putin to walk back quite a long way on his demands, then possibly there is a deal there to be done. But in every previous negotiation, it has seemed a long way apart.
I mean, I've been going back and forth to Ukraine for years now. Also I started going in 2014. And the thing that's always struck me is that actually for the Russians, it's not really about land. I mean, land is great because land means you can occupy it and you can call it part of your own country. But actually it's about spheres of influence. It's about history. It's about legacy. Kyiv was a functioning, city of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, when Moscow was a turnip field, back in the 9th century and the 10th century. I think Putin still dreams of walking into St. Sophia Cathedral in the center of Kyiv, and he certainly doesn't want Ukraine to be an independent, sovereign nation state. Given that, even if there's a deal done, surely this doesn't bode well for the future, does it?
No, it doesn't. I completely agree with what you've just said, and I don't think Putin will stop. But he himself will stop until he gets that, or unless he gets that. Of course, Putin won't be there forever, and I think any future Russian leader, even if very much in the mould of Putin, would be unlikely to repeat or pursue this war because it has been devastating for Russia as well, and it has not been the easy rolling in to Kyiv that Putin obviously expected at the beginning. But at the moment we have Putin, and with his dreams very much as you described.
And so, Mark, if this goes wrong and either the Ukrainians are seen to be thrown under the bus or they don't accept a deal, a shoddy deal that's concocted in Alaska, or the war just continues and Russia feels, it's got the upper hand at some stage, how devastating is this for the rest of Europe, the EU and Britain?
It's absolutely devastating. There's no question. I think Britain and most of the Europeans will continue to support Zelensky if he continues to prosecute the war, even if the Americans decide to stop doing so. That is a commitment that the Europeans have made because they see that it's not just about Ukraine, it's about sort of European security more widely. But of course, in that situation, it's likely to be a very protracted conflict and it's unlikely to end better, as it were, for Zelensky or Ukraine in the longer term than a deal now which does cede some territory. So, a deal is a good thing, but it's got to be sustainable and it's got to therefore stop what you and Bronwen were talking about, Putin coming back for more because he wants to walk into the cathedrals in Kyiv.
When you look at the last few months since Trump has taken office, it does feel like that, that movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once. He's used tariffs as a geopolitical tool. He's threatened to annex Canada and Greenland, take over the Panama Canal. We question his commitment towards NATO, towards Western Europe. The values on which the post-World War II order were based seem to have been frayed, to put it mildly. Do you think 2025 will be remembered as a pivotal year in which the kind of wheels of history started to spin in a very different direction? Let me ask you that question, Mark.
I'm not sure we would say that 2025 is necessarily the sort of critical year. I think we've been drifting really since about 2014, 2015 into a world where the rules-based order no longer applies and more countries are basically opting out and deciding that might is right. And I think President Trump's re-election has exacerbated that. But we're seeing it from China, we're seeing it from Russia, we're seeing it from Iran, from Turkey. Many other countries have just decided that their national interests will take priority over a organized and agreed global order.
Okay, Bronwen, 20 seconds to you. 2025 is the beginning of a new global order or disorder?
New global disorder, but you may see the beginnings of other countries beginning to form their own order. It just won't look like the last one.